spring is fast approaching. We've all been busy ordering our seeds. We've got our plans ready, pen put to paper, and now it's time for us to make sure that our growing spaces are prepared and ready and waiting for these baby plants in just a few weeks' time. When I initially designed my growing space, I made a lot of errors, largely due to the fact that any research I was doing and the information that I was using to create my garden was more suited to that of large commercial growers and flower farmers. So this video is intended, hopefully, to be helpful to those of you that want to grow cut flowers, but maybe on a much smaller scale, say a micro flower farm or a cut flower garden.
Not everyone chooses to fence their growing space. And this can be because you are growing in a rented space or temporary area, or because the cost just makes it prohibitive.
When it comes to boundaries and fencing, my personal experience has shown me that it would be, for me, definitely an essential addition to your garden. I know there are lots of people who do manage to grow cut flowers with absolutely no fencing, and I just think they must have a huge amount of luck, or perhaps they're growing in such large scale, such volumes that they don't notice if a rabbit or a deer has eaten some of the plants. But I think if you're growing on a smaller scale, you're really going to notice if you've only got one block of something and a rabbit comes and eats it all in one go, then it's definitely noticeable. And not only for that, my fencing doesn't just provide protection against rabbits and deer, but it's also helping with some form of protection against the weather.
Originally, I did not bury my fencing wire into the ground. And those of you that follow my channel will know that by failing to take that step, rabbits found their way into my garden and proceeded to cause havoc, meaning I had no choice but to make improvements to my fencing by digging in more wire at a later date. Failing to do this in the beginning ultimately cost me more time and money. And if I was starting this whole process again, I would make sure I did this right at the beginning. If you are growing in an exposed or windy site, it is a good idea to reduce wind speeds by providing some sort of break, by planting a hedge or perhaps using an artificial windbreak.
Solid fences are not really suitable to help break wind unless they're really, really high. I'm thinking of perhaps lovely stoned garden, kitchen garden, where the walls are much, much higher than 6 foot. The trouble with solid walls of a lower level is all that happens is the wind, it doesn't break the speed, it just changes the angle in which the wind will come into your growing space. Instead, it's recommended that a windbreak you have, whether it be a nice natural hedge or some weaved willow, or for me, I use a fabric windbreak, that they should let through 50% of the wind. When it comes to the orientation of your garden, I only wish I had have given this some consideration in the beginning. I didn't even think about the fact I had a hedge and that it might be shady under there, let alone what way was east, west, north or south. I didn't know where the sun was going to be. And we all know from any garden, whether it be a growing space or even our cottage gardens, that the first thing you should do when you move in before you grow it is have a look at all those things, where the sun is, at what parts of the day, to work out how to build your beds. And slap on the wrist that I didn't do that. And then as a result, I've had to completely reconfigure things when I went into my second season.
In my first growing season, I orientated my beds from east to west, meaning that any tall crops in the bed on the south side of the plot began to shade the shorter plants on the north side. In the northern hemisphere, those of us north of the equator, most experts believe the best way to orient your beds for optimum light is from north to south, which is how my garden is now laid out. Because I plant more than one variety of plant in each of my growing beds, it is important that I remember to plant the taller crops at the north end of the beds, unless I want to deliberately provide shade to encourage stretching or to provide a cooler environment to any shorter plants.
I think when it comes to paths and walkways, it really does depend on what size area you've got to be working with. If you want to future-proof your garden, if you might be starting small but perhaps would like it to be a business in the future, maybe you're thinking you might like to invest in a tractor or possibly open to the public, do cut your own, pick your own flowers, things like that, then if you can, then yeah, great idea. Put nice wide paths in the beginning with plenty of turning for machinery, and also that will comply with all of the health and safety regulations that there might be around opening to the public. If, however, you do have a limited space and it's always going to be limited, then for me, particularly in my perennial area of my cut flower patch, which is the first bit I built, I went small, I went narrow on my paths. I went with 0.5 metre, 50 centimetres, which is not wide enough for a wheelbarrow or a trolley when the plants are growing. It's just wide enough for me to shuffle down with my bucket and my snips. But actually, for me, that works. It's not wide enough to have grass walkways like that, because once the plants start to grow, there really is not a lot of space and you wouldn't get a mower through there. So if you're going to have narrow paths like that, you really want to have some sort of other solution underfoot. Whereas my new annual section of the garden, I opted that I was going to have it as grass, and because of that the paths are 1 metre wide, and this allows access with the push lawnmower, but definitely not a ride-on lawnmower. I think for me, one of the most important things I learned was mulch, mulch and mulch again. Mulching is fantastic at both suppressing weeds by blocking out sunlight, and yes, it won't suppress all of them, but it definitely reduces weed pressure. But for me, I think one of the most important values of having some sort of mulch is that it will prevent moisture leaving the soil through evaporation. It just helps the soil to retain that moisture.
When I originally started my cut flower garden, I chose to use permeable weed fabric to mulch my beds. But after my first season of growing, I realised this is probably better suited to much larger growing areas, and was actually causing my beds to become compacted, lifeless, with poor drainage. I soon realised that a good thick layer of biodegradable mulch would be much more benefit to my soil by improving its structure and adding nutrients. So every autumn I mulch my beds ready to be planted the following spring. Seed sowing is definitely the part of growing that can be very easy or very difficult. All it takes is for there to be one slug or snail hiding out in your greenhouse, and you can find yourself starting all over again.
In my first year of growing, I started my seeds way too early. I didn't have a greenhouse, I didn't have grow lights, and I was just relying on the light from my windows and foil and mirrors. And it really wasn't a great idea. And now, even though I have a greenhouse and I have grow lights, I still only really start 4 things in January. I did just do a video of sweet peas, snapdragons, stock, and then I often start larkspur as well. And I get away with starting those things because actually they quite like growing on in the cool. And for me, snapdragons are so slow. It's better if I autumn sow them, which I do tend to do. But anyway, then I wait. And I've now learned that the best time to start my seeds is mid-February for me. And that's because here in the southwest of the UK, that marks the time when we get 10 hours of sunlight. 12 hours is better. But hardy annuals and hardy perennials, which are what I start in mid-February, will grow on happily with 10 hours of light. But it is still better, as I mentioned in my last video, if you've got, you know, really well lit areas like conservatories or greenhouses. If you will find, if you grow them in a window, even with 10 hours of light in February, you can do it, so don't let me put you off. But to stop them getting leggy, you will need to turn the trays, otherwise they'll really start leaning. So when we get to mid-February, we'll have a get together, maybe, I was going to say the week before, but that's probably this week's video, but we'll have a get together soon where I will go through what I'm going to be sowing in February.
In my first season growing cut flowers, I found that both germinating and growing on seedlings was fairly easy and not too challenging, especially as I was growing easy to grow varieties. And I will link a video that I made last year with my selection of easy to grow cut flowers for beginners. In my second year, I opted to stop using peat compost for growing, and I soon found that my seed starting experience was totally different. Not remotely easy. Germination was not too much of a problem, more that the plants just sat in the pots and survived rather than thrived. They just did not seem to achieve the same amount of root growth that they had when growing in peat.
I still have an awful lot to learn when it comes to growing with peat-free compost. And I keep blaming the compost, but they do say that a bad workman blames his tools. And I've tried several different types, and I have realised a couple of things that definitely help my plants grow. I still have not perfected this process by any means, but if I were giving advice, I would definitely say watering from underneath. Sometimes the peat-free compost can really dry out on the top, so water from underneath, and it will just encourage those roots to really grow down. You don't want them really shallow rooted at the top. You want them to get their roots down so that when you pull them out of their cells, they've got really good, healthy root growth. And I tend to pot on. And I find that actually with the peat-free compost, I don't like to pot them up into a too big a pot too quickly. So I'd rather pot them on 2 or 3 times before they go into the garden, which when I initially started with peat, I didn't need to do that. I could just put them in, you know, a much bigger pot and they would grow on quite happily. And then the other thing that I like to do is to, when they're having their drink up from underneath, I'll have a little bit of seaweed fertilizer in that as well. And those are definitely things that I've found have helped. Also, I find that keep an eye on the weather and don't water when you know you're going to have a frost. Look out for full moon, and obviously keep an eye on the weather and cloud cover. I find for me, you know, if I'm thinking it's quite a cloudy day, it might be quite a good day to water, whereas if it's been clear and sunny, there's quite possibly a clear night will mean a frost. And that has definitely helped me to plan when I'm watering so that I've not got dampening off issues from plants being sat in really damp, cold environment.
I do not have a large enough space to succession sow all of the varieties that I like to grow. So generally, I choose a selection of hardy annuals that can be sown in the autumn and then again in the spring. I also like to sow my sunflowers every 2 weeks, although last year I had a very limited amount of seed. I think I had 20 sunflowers in all. By having several successions of my hardy annuals, I am able to cut these varieties over a longer period of time. Now I'd like to talk very briefly about spacing of plants, and in my next video, or maybe even the video after that, I will actually be running through the planting plan I have for my garden this season. All of my beds are 1 metre wide, and this allows me to reach the centre of the bed from both sides so that my plants can easily be harvested. In my first season, I had a totally unpractical layout and so found getting to my flowers a serious struggle. My perennial beds are 6 metres long and my annual beds are 5 metres long. Because I use biodegradable mulches in favour of weed membrane fabric, it allows me more flexibility with what spacing can be allocated to my plants. So I am able to plant varieties with different spacing requirements in the same planting bed without worrying about the holes in the plastic. I use 15 centimetre spacing, 20 centimetre spacing, 25 centimetre spacing very occasionally, and 30 centimetre spacing for my plants, and I plant them in either 1 metre by 1 metre blocks or 1 metre by 75 centimetre sections. The spacing plants requires drastically alters how many plants you can fit into a space, and I will just pop a table onto the screen now which shows a real difference in how many plants you can fit in both those size sections.
When it comes to staking and support, I think it really does make a difference what you're intending to do with your flowers when you cut them. Because if you are really keen on arranging, and by that I mean making arrangements in vessels, or maybe even moss and wire, but you're looking to create shape and form, then sometimes having poker straight stems actually isn't ideal. Sometimes you need those natural curves from the way that things grow in the garden when they're not supported. If, however, you do want to do wrap bouquets, then obviously you want your flowers to be not necessarily completely straight, but you want them straight-ish. And depending on how windy your growing location is, will depend on how well you need to stake things. And for me, I know in the beginning I used the horizontal pea netting, and I know it works for a lot of people, but it really just did not work for me. For one, I was terrible at cutting the netting when I was cutting the plants. User error, I know, but anyway, I don't use it anymore and I do not miss it at all.
My latest and favourite method is to use metal stock fencing, which conveniently is self-supporting.
So we've got our plants planted out, we've staked them, and now we just need to care for them long enough for them to flower so that we can actually cut and create with them. And for me, one of the main benefits we've already touched on is by mulching my plants, it greatly reduces the amount of reliance they have on me to water them. And generally speaking, I water them in really well when they're small plants in the spring when they go in, and I'll give them really good waters. None of this just watering a little bit every day, but give them a really good drink for a couple of weeks, and then I pretty much let them get on with it, unless we are having a drought year, which obviously every so many years we do have a drought, and then I will need to give them a drink. But I do find that once they've got to the flowering point, they can cope very well. But that is largely due to the heavy mulch, which is helping to stop any moisture evaporate from the surface of the soil.
I use my sprayer to foliar feed my plants before they flower. And I don't do this so much to promote extra growth, because I don't really want leafy growth. But instead, I want my plants to be strong and able to cope with the stresses of climate and the pressures from pests and diseases. I like to use EnviroMesh crop protection netting for any hardy annuals planted out early in the spring, where there is still a risk of frost. I also use this for growing my stock, due to the fact that they are not cut and come again and will not flower if the stems are damaged by pests. In order to stagger flowering slightly, I do tend to Chelsea chop,
which, if you're in the UK, the Chelsea chop, you probably know what it is. It's where at the end of May, beginning of June, which would coincide with the Chelsea Flower Show, you go along and you just chop some of your plants down, and then it will encourage them to grow up and flower later. So what I tend to do is in one of my metre squared patches, I'll go along, oregano for example, and I'll cut half of it down. And that means I can harvest the first half first, which I left tall and growing. And then by the time I've finished harvesting that, the second half, which I'd given the Chelsea chop, will be growing up, and then I can start cutting from that. And I have definitely found that invaluable.
Now I have grown a beautiful garden of cut flowers, I can spend time enjoying my flowers while keeping on top of the weeds. And I am well aware that the way I grow is not necessarily the way that everyone else grows. We all have different soils, climates, experiences and lifestyles. I just wanted to share my experience and what has worked for me. Now, I've only touched very briefly on some of these subjects. This is really just a guide to help those of you just starting out. Most of you probably will have already learnt these lessons yourself.
So you can see that I have learned so many lessons during my growing journey, and let's be honest, I have definitely not finished learning. I learn something new pretty much every single day, and with that, in the comments, please let me know what lessons you've learned, because it's very likely that I may be able to learn from those as well. And with that, thank you to all of you who commented in my last video. So many of you commented, and it was really lovely to hear about all the exciting projects that you've all got planned. It definitely sounds as if you're just excited as I am for the next growing season to begin. If you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to follow my growing and gardening journey, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to contribute towards the making of these videos, you can of course buy me a coffee, and the link for coffee buying is in the description to the video. And thank you, huge thank you to those of you that have bought me coffees. You are the most lovely, generous people, and it really does mean so much to me. So thank you again for that. That's it for this week. So thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next time.